There's a two-door hardtop sitting at the end of an assembly line in South Bend, Indiana. Someone has taken a can of shaving cream, or maybe white shoe polish, and written across the windshield, "Merry Christmas." It is December 20th, 1963, 5 days before the holiday. This car will be the last one built on American soil. In 111 years, through the Civil War, the Great Depression, 2 World Wars, and the birth of the automobile itself, this is the final Studebaker ever assembled in South Bend. No band plays, no executive gives a speech. A foreman signs a sheet, the line stops, and roughly 7,000 people walk out of a gate their fathers and grandfathers walked through before them. This is the story of the company that built the wagons the Union Army rode to war, the company that once employed more people than almost any factory in Indiana, and the company that finally died not because it made a bad car, but because it refused for 100 years to stop taking care of its own people. That sentence is going to sound strange by the end of this video. Hold on to it. Part 1. The Wagon That Would Not Quit. South Bend, Indiana, February 16, 1852. Two brothers, Henry and Clement Studebaker, open a blacksmith shop on the corner of Michigan and Jefferson. $68 in capital. 2 forges. No idea that their name is about to become one of the most trusted in American industry. They build wagons, farm wagons first, then something better. A durable, well-engineered covered wagon that becomes the standard by which every other wagon in the Midwest is measured. During the Civil War, the United States government signs a contract with the Studebaker brothers for military wagons, not because they are the cheapest, because they are the ones that do not break down in the mud outside a battlefield. That government contract does something to this company that never fully goes away. It teaches Studebaker that quality and durability, not price, are what win contracts and loyalty. It is a lesson that will make this company beloved for a century. It is also, quietly, the first thread in the rope that eventually hangs it. By the 1890s, Studebaker is the largest wagon manufacturer on Earth. 5 brothers, 1 company, a reputation stretching from Indiana to California. Then, in the 1890s, a decision that most of their competitors in the carriage trade refused to make. It is not one of the Studebaker brothers who pushes the company toward the automobile. It is Frederick Fish, a Wall Street lawyer who married into the family, who has to overcome real resistance from the surviving brothers themselves to get the company into the horseless carriage business at all. In 1902, Studebaker builds its first automobile, an electric car. 2 years later, in 1904, the first gasoline-powered Studebaker goes on sale. Studebaker becomes the only major wagon and carriage manufacturer in the country to successfully make the leap into the automobile age. Every other coach builder of its size simply disappears. For a company built on a 2-forge blacksmith shop, that is a remarkable act of self-reinvention. It will not be the last one this company is forced to make. It will, however, be the last one that works cleanly. Part 2. The family that never wanted a fight. Here's the part of the Studebaker story that almost nobody tells, and it is the part that explains everything that comes after. Through the 1910s and 1920s, as the company transitions fully into automobiles, Studebaker builds something rarer than a good car. It builds a culture. Wages at the South Bend plant run consistently among the highest in American manufacturing. Benefits, job security, a paternal relationship between the company and its workforce that dates back to the family ownership of the wagon years. And here's the number that should stop you. For more than a century of operation, through the most violent, strike-torn era of American labor history, Studebaker's South Bend plant does not experience a single official strike by the United Auto Workers. Compare that to what is happening 60 miles up the road in Detroit, where Walter Reuther is being beaten by Ford security men outside the River Rouge plant in 1937, where General Motors endures a 113-day strike through the winter of 1945 into 1946, where Chrysler workers walk out for over 100 days that same year. Studebaker's workers do not need to fight for what General Motors workers are bleeding for, because Studebaker already gives most of it to them, informally, out of habit, out of a family culture that predates the automobile itself. This is not weakness. This is, genuinely, one of the more decent labor relationships in the history of American heavy industry. If you are looking for the villain in this story, you will not find him in the executive suite in the 1920s or 1930s. You will find something much harder to hate and much harder to fix. A company that loved its workers exactly as much as it could not afford to. The Great Depression very nearly ends Studebaker anyway. In March 1933, the company is forced into court-ordered bankruptcy. Albert Erskine, the company's president for 18 years, the man who built the post-war Studebaker into an industrial power, is drowning in personal debt from his own high dividend policies and failing health. On July 1, 1933, 4 months after the bankruptcy filing, he takes his own life. New management strips the company down, sells off the luxury Pierce Arrow brand acquired in the 20s, drops a failed budget line called the Wagon, and by January 1935, a reorganized Studebaker Corporation climbs back out of receivership. A parade runs through downtown South Bend to celebrate. The city believes, not unreasonably, that Studebaker has proven something permanent about itself, that it always comes back. Part 3. The War and the Decade That Fools Everyone. World War II is very good to Studebaker. In January 1941, the company signs contracts with the federal government, which finances the construction of 3 new factories and leases them back to Studebaker to build the Wright Cyclone engine, the same 9-cylinder radial engine that powers the B-17 Flying Fortress. Studebaker's plants will eventually turn out nearly 64,000 of these engines. Studebaker's own engineers also design and build the M29 Weasel, a tracked amphibious cargo carrier that will serve on snow, sand, and open water from Europe to the Pacific. Roughly 5,600 Studebaker employees leave South Bend to serve in the war. 111 of them never come home. When peace arrives in 1945, Studebaker, like every American automaker, walks into a golden decade nobody has to work very hard to enjoy. 20 years of pent-up consumer demand, a country with money and no cars to spend it on. Studebaker answers with some of the most beautiful automobiles Detroit's own stylists have ever envied, except they are not designed in Detroit. French-born designer Raymond Loewy, already famous for the Coca-Cola bottle and the Lucky Strike pack, gives Studebaker the 1953 Starliner and Starlight coupes. Cars so ahead of their era that automotive historians still call them some of the most influential shapes of the decade. By 1950, Studebaker is producing close to 500,000 cars and trucks a year and employing 24,000 people in South Bend alone. Look at that year again, 1950. The same year, 60 miles east in Detroit, Walter Reuther is signing the Treaty of Detroit with General Motors. Guaranteed pensions, guaranteed health care, cost of living wage increases, locked in for good regardless of what the market does next. Studebaker's workers already have most of that, informally, out of 100 years of company habit. Nobody in South Bend in 1950 sits down to calculate what a fixed, permanent obligation to 24,000 workers and their eventual retirements is going to cost a company that does not have the sales volume of General Motors to absorb it. Why would they? Studebaker has survived a civil war, a depression, and a world war. The wagon that would not quit is not going to quit now. That belief is about to become the most expensive assumption in the company's history. Part 4. The math nobody in South Bend controls. Here is the arithmetic that decides Studebaker's fate, and it has almost nothing to do with the cars themselves. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler can each spread the fixed cost of a plant, a labor contract, a pension obligation across millions of vehicles a year and dozens of factories. Studebaker has to spread that exact same category of cost, built up out of the exact same decades of decent paternal labor relations, across a single aging plant in South Bend producing a fraction of that volume. By the early 1950s, Studebaker's labor costs per vehicle are the highest in the American automobile industry. Not because the company is careless, because the company is generous, and generosity spread across too few. Units becomes unsustainable. Then the big three do something to Studebaker that has nothing to do with fairness. In 1953 and 1954, Ford and General Motors go to war with each other, flooding the market with discounted, aggressively priced cars to fight for market share. It is a war between giants. Studebaker is not a giant. It is a bystander standing too close to the blast radius. Independent automakers across the country get crushed in the crossfire of a price war they did not start and cannot afford to fight. Studebaker's sales collapse, and by 1954, the company is losing money outright. The board reaches for the only lever left: consolidation. A merger with Packard, the once great luxury nameplate now similarly wounded, is put together in 1954. It becomes the Studebaker-Packard Corporation, led by Packard's own president, James Nance, who believes that combined, the two companies can achieve the economies of scale neither can manage alone. It is the same logic that years later and an ocean away will push a struggling British car company into the arms of an American conglomerate. It does not work here either. Once the deal closes, Studebaker's cash position turns out to be far worse than anyone disclosed to Packard during negotiations. By 1956, the combined company is nearly bankrupt. Instead of one strong company, South Bend now has two weak ones wearing the same balance sheet. By the late 1950s, the Packard name is quietly retired. The merger built to save both companies ends up only slowing down the moment each of them dies alone. Part 5. The man who almost pulled it off. If this story has a hero, and it does not have very many, it is a man named Sherwood Egbert. Egbert becomes Studebaker's president in 1961, and he is exactly what a company in this position needs. Relentless, a workaholic, genuinely certain that a company with over a century of goodwill in the American public still has something left to sell. He greenlights one of the most audacious projects in the company's history. A fiberglass-bodied sports coupe designed in a single, frantic burst of work by Raymond Loewy's studio. It is called the Avanti. It launches in 1962 to genuine critical acclaim, praised by the motoring press as one of the most striking American cars of the decade, setting speed records at Bonneville that stand for years. But timing in this story is never kind. On January 1st, 1962, just as Egbert is trying to rally the workforce around a comeback, the first official strike in the plant's entire history begins at South Bend. 38 days on the picket line, the one moment in over 100 years when the old paternal peace finally breaks. It is a sign, in hindsight, of just how much strain the company's finances were putting on a relationship that had held since 1852. Egbert crosses the picket line in his own Mercedes-Benz, an image that does not exactly help. The strike ends with an agreement negotiated personally between Egbert and Walter Reuther, the same man who signed the Treaty of Detroit 12 years earlier, now sitting across the table from a company trying to survive the very industry-wide forces that treaty had helped set in motion. Despite the strike, 1962 actually sees a sales uptick. For one brief moment, it looks like Egbert might actually be pulling it off. Then the press starts writing that Studebaker is about to leave the car business entirely, and something brutal happens. The speculation becomes true simply by being said out loud. Buyers, worried about being stuck with what the industry calls an orphan car, a brand with no dealer network, no parts supply, no resale value, start staying away in advance of the collapse everyone is now predicting. NBC airs a documentary in May 1963 called Studebaker, Fight for Survival. You do not put a company's name in a headline like that and expect customers to keep walking into the showroom. By the fall of 1963, Egbert, now battling serious health problems, is pushed out of the presidency with 2 years left on his contract. He had wanted to spend heavily re-engineering Studebaker's cars for 1965. The board, out of cash and out of patience, says no. Part 6. The 5 minutes nobody saw coming and the 5 minutes everybody had feared. The news breaks on December 9, 1963, 17 days after President Kennedy's assassination, in a country that is still reeling. Word goes out that Studebaker is closing its South Bend plant. 11 days later, December 20th, the first date. Last car rolls off the line, the hardtop with Merry Christmas scrawled across the windshield. Roughly 7,000 workers, about 8% of the entire regional workforce, are sent home. 111 years of continuous operation, from the founding blacksmith shop to the final assembly line, ends not with an explosion but with a signature on a piece of paper. Here is what makes this different from almost every other story like it. This was not simply a company that ran out of luck. Ask the people who worked there, and they will tell you Studebaker had come back from disaster before, and there was no obvious reason to believe it would not come back again. But the underlying arithmetic never changed. A company carrying the fixed contractual cost of a fair and decent relationship with its workforce, spread across a fraction of the sales volume of its giant competitors in an industry now locked in a price war those giants had started. Studebaker was not undone by cruelty. It was undone by decency it could no longer afford to keep paying for. Studebaker itself, as a corporation, does not disappear that day. Automobile production shifts entirely to a much smaller Studebaker plant in Hamilton, Ontario, where the brand limps on as what the industry cruelly calls an import. Built in Canada, sold in a shrinking number of American showrooms, increasingly unwilling to stock an orphan brand. It does not last. On March 16, 1966, the Hamilton plant builds its final car, a turquoise cruiser sedan, and the Studebaker name leaves the automobile business for good 114 years after two brothers opened a blacksmith shop for $68 in tools. Part 7. The bill nobody had written down. Here is where this story stops being about cars entirely and where it earns its place in American law. In the very weeks of that December 1963 closure, it becomes clear that the pension plan Studebaker had promised its workers for decades, That same paternal, generous, 100-year-old habit of taking care of its own people cannot actually pay what it owes. The plan is so badly underfunded that thousands of Studebaker workers and retirees, men who had given the company 20, 30, 35 years of their working lives on the promise of a secure retirement, receive only a fraction of what they were owed. Some receive nothing at all. That failure becomes one of the loudest alarm bells in the entire American labor movement. According to the U.S. Department of Labor's own history of pension reform, the movement gained real momentum specifically because of what happened at Studebaker in 1963. It becomes Exhibit A in a decade-long push for federal protection, and in 1974, Congress passes the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA, the law that still governs and insures private pensions in the United States today. Every American worker who has ever been told their pension is protected by federal law owes some small, invisible debt to the men who walked out of that South Bend gate in December 1963 and discovered that the promise made to their fathers had quietly come apart. Studebaker built the wagons the Union rode to war. It built some of the most beautiful cars Detroit's own stylists ever envied. And in the end, its most lasting legacy is not a car at all. It is a federal law that exists because this company tried to keep a promise it could no longer pay for and did not find out how badly it had failed until it was already too late. Part 8. What is left? Drive through South Bend today and you will find pieces of it still standing, more than most company towns get to keep. Building 84, the 6-story former main assembly plant on the south edge of downtown, sat empty and decaying for decades. Today it is being restored as the anchor of something called the Renaissance District, a mixed-use technology campus with offices, apartments, and a data center running underneath one of the densest fiber corridors in the country. The Studebaker National Museum, a few blocks away, keeps the Avantis and Starliners under careful lighting, loved by collectors in a way the company itself was never quite loved by its own balance sheet. But most of the roughly 100 acres that once made up the largest employer in the region are gone, demolished, sold, absorbed, some of it still tied up decades later in environmental litigation over ground contaminated by over a century of heavy industry. And here is the strange, almost unbelievable coda to this story. Ask the economic historians of South Bend today, and many of them will tell you something that sounds impossible. That Studebaker closing in 1963, in a booming national economy before the broader collapse of Midwestern manufacturing had even begun, may have been one of the better things that happened to the city in the long run. Other manufacturers, hungry for a skilled, available workforce in a growing national economy, moved into the vacated buildings within months. The city was forced, while it still had the chance, into the kind of economic diversification that Detroit, protected by its own scale for another 50 years, would not be forced into until it was far too late, until the same fixed, generous, decades-old promises Studebaker could not afford in 1963 finally caught up with General Motors and with the city of Detroit itself in a bankruptcy filing 50 years later that was many times the size. Studebaker did not fail because it made bad cars. Raymond Loewy's coupes are still, 6 decades later, sitting in museums under glass. It did not fail because its workers were greedy or its executives were careless. It failed because it kept a 100-year-old promise to treat its people better than the industry strictly required, in a business that was, by the 1950s, only built to reward companies who could spread that promise across millions of cars instead of thousands. Detroit's giants would eventually drown in the exact same water. It just took them another 50 years and billions more dollars to find the bottom. If your father or your grandfather worked the line in South Bend, if a Studebaker sat in your driveway growing up, or if you have ever walked past what is left of that plant on the south side of the city, tell us in the comments. These are not just company histories. They are the story of what an entire century of American families believed a job was supposed to give them, and what it cost the companies who tried to actually give it to them. If this one hit the way the last one did, stay subscribed. There are more of these towns and more of these promises, and we are not done telling you about them yet.